everybody else was trying to avoid the service too. And the only ones that were open was the Marine Corps. So I suddenly found myself at Parris Island as an enlisted man. And, but overall, I got to say, it's sort of surprising. It's now like 50 years later than that or longer than that. What a tremendous influence on me the Marine Corps was. And I'm still learning it every day. It somehow gets into your bones, as you guys all know. And so I salute all of you midshipmen that have chosen to come down to Quantico for this experience. And I think even if you wind up, choosing the Navy, these weeks will stick with you. But I hope that you do go with the Marine Corps. It is a totally unique outfit in many wonderful ways.
That was as good a sales pitch as I could think of, sir. Appreciate that. So I'm looking at page 355. And I don't know if you want me to, I could read the text. I've got the text here. If
yeah, please do. Actually, I don't even have the book in front of me here. I should.
I bet you know it.
I know it so well. I don't need to do that.
Sure. So here's what you do, friends. Forget country, forget king, forget wife and children and freedom. Forget every concept, however noble, that you imagine you fight for here today. Act for this alone. For the man who stands at your shoulder, he is everything and everything is contained within him. That's all I know. That's all I can tell you. And when I read that passage, I reflect back to my first deployment to Afghanistan, and it just makes me think of my platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Henley, who's now First Sergeant Henley, and how he really was, everything was contained within him. And when you're closing that last 100 meters on the enemy, that's it. It's that bond, and that drives you forward when everything else would tell you that you shouldn't do this thing. It's you're compelled to do that thing because of that tie. And so much of my warrior ethos brief kind of emphasized the notion of philia and the brotherly love that I think your text so brilliantly kind of explores and educates us all on. And so maybe if you can just start with that passage, and then we'll start to turn to the mids and see what questions they got.
Well, I think that idea that you're doing it for the man or woman that's at your shoulders, like, goes back to the primitive hunting band. I mean, it's not even an intellectual concept. It's just a totally visceral concept. The idea that you just have to stand shoulder to shoulder, because alone there's no way to prevail, whether we're fighting mastodons or something else, But to me, the pertinent thing about that's the fictional character Dionysius is saying that in that moment. I mean, I put those words in his mouth. But if you read Herodotus, he was a real guy, and who was the basically judged the bravest and the best of all the Spartans that were there at Thermopylae. So the amazing thing to me about that whole story of Thermopylae, I mean, the real story is, when we read about it, it's so far in the past. This is actually the 2500th anniversary this August of that event. It seems like a legend. It's like reading about, Achilles and the Trojan War or something. But the fact is, these were real guys. It had really happened. And this was a real man who was really there and really said those things. So that's the amazing thing to me. I mean, what made me kind of want to write Gates of Fire was reading the passage in Herodotus about where Dionysius is told that the Persian archers were so numerous that when they fired their volleys, the arrows blocked out the sun, and he says, "Good, we'll have our battle in the shade." I thought like you, Tom, I thought of like Marines that I knew that would have said something exactly like that, and the 2,500 years has just sort of vanished. And I felt like, I can just imagine who this guy is, and that really nothing has changed in the kind of warrior mindset at that elite level. So.
Yes, sir. Always good to have a good history lesson with Herodotus. We appreciate that. I'll turn it over. I have many questions, but the mids, if you want to start, you can jump in, or if you want to start dropping some questions in the chat, please feel free to do that. So we'll give someone a second to jump on the line. Otherwise, I have a lot of questions, so we'll see where we go.
Is everybody going to be shy?
Sir, this is Captain John Brown. I'm sorry for not having the video up. My bandwidth is too low to be able to push the video. But, sir, I was really struck by the quote when you talk about the difference between a Spartan king and the Spartans themselves. And so the quote itself specifically says, "What's the difference between a Spartan king and a mid-ranker? One man will lob this query to his mate as they prepare to bed down in the open of cold driving rain. His friend considers mock theatrically for a moment. Quote, the king sleeps in that shithole over there. He replies, we sleep in this shithole over here." And one of the marked qualities of a Marine Corps officer is this idea of co-suffering alongside the people that they lead. And I just wanted to know what generated your interest in including that specifically in the book, and how that played into Spartan culture and what that meant to them in the concept of the conduct of combat.
It's a great question, and I absolutely stole that completely from the Marine Corps, and just figured, it probably was exactly the same back then. In fact, some of the static that I've gotten about Gates of Fire when I get bad comments is they say, these Spartans sound more like contemporary Marines than they do like ancient warriors. But I really did feel one of the things that I wanted to contrast in Gates of Fire was the Spartan concept of combat versus the Persian concept, and particularly what the king, what we had Leonidas on one side and Xerxes on the other. And according to Herodotus, Xerxes, watched the whole battle from a throne up on a hill. And whereas Leonidas was right down there in the trenches with everybody else doing exactly the same thing. So I think that that was critical to the whole kind of Spartan concept of that bound the men together, that their king was right there with them, suffering. He was there to die just like they were, and to dig ditches just like they were. And that I think is a crucial thing in any outfit.
And so that's perhaps best exemplified when the passage, I'll tell you His Majesty what a king is. A king does not abide within his tent. That whole the concept of being a servant leader and a fighter leader, I think is really what we hopefully are all here striving to achieve. I do have my first question, and hopefully one of many more to come from our mids here. If this is from Midshipman Willard. She says, do you think we have become weak as a society because we do not surround ourselves with violence, pain, and hardship as the Spartans did from a young age and on a daily basis?
It's a great question. It's funny, I was just reading, and I recommend this to everybody. I know you guys are all swamped with stuff to read about. I just was reading in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. I don't know if you guys are familiar at all with Pericles' funeral oration, if that rings a bell. But the gist of it is Pericles, the great Athenian, gave a speech during this war against Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, like 40, 50 years after Thermopylae. And he contrasted the Athenian way with the Spartan way. And one of the things he said was, we Athenians don't put ourselves through this same agoge-like training and hardship that the Spartans do, but yet we stand up to them and show as much courage as they do. And if you think back to, we talk about the World War II generation, the greatest generation, and the sacrifices that they made, the Marines in the Pacific, and with the Army in D-Day, and all of the bomber stuff that went on, and how the Americans rose to that challenge, fighting men and women rose to that challenge. But if you read some of the comments about Americans before the war, immediately before World War II, like from the way the Japanese perceived us and the Germans perceived us, they thought we were totally soft and lazy and couldn't do, and then it just roll right over us because we were so, we were so selfish and so individualistic. but Americans really rose to the challenge there. Now, I don't know if the same thing is true today. Um, that's a really, really good question. Um, I tend to believe in, as much as I believe in the kind of Spartan concept of, you know, embracing adversity, it does seem like um, Americans, with all their freedom, still have got it in their DNA that when the bell sounds, if it's serious enough and it's not some phony baloney political stunt, that they're ready to rise to the occasion. I hope that's true.
Sir, I can be cautiously optimistic here and attest that, you know, we have 250 of great Americans here that would and are willing to do that, and I'm inspired every day.
I'm sure that's true.
Interaction with midshipmen. We have a question from Midshipman Harrison, and they're asking what text should we look at as we prepare to embark on a journey as Marine officers, if you had any recommendations.
I do, actually. I've been thinking about this lately, and I'll give you the short ones first. If you look up Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, Lycurgus, Life of Lycurgus. Lycurgus was the George Washington of Sparta. He was the guy who, before he came along, which was, as they describe it in the text, was so far in antiquity that they couldn't tell if he was a man or a god. But he was the one, at that point, Sparta was like just a regular Greek city where they'd go to war in the summertime and they'd get their ass kicked half the time and they'd win the other half of the time. And he was the guy who changed the whole society into what it was and established the laws that, they were known as the laws of Lycurgus. And so it's a short thing. It's probably only 10 pages long, but it really kind of boils down the Spartan way into a really digestible thing. Another book that's a little hard to find, but it's really worth it, is Xenophon with an X, The Education of Cyrus. And Xenophon was an Athenian around the time of Pericles, around the Peloponnesian War, but he was very friendly with Sparta, and he actually wound up living there. And The Education of Cyrus is supposedly, it's interesting, and it's almost like a novel. If there was a first novel, that's it. It purports to be how Cyrus the Great, the guy who really founded the Persian Empire and was kind of a forerunner of Alexander the Great. It's really about how he operated. But the word was that Xenophon really patterned it after Spartan upbringing. And it talked about how the young men were, how they slept outdoors, et cetera, et cetera. So and it's also a really interesting, both of these are fun reads, The Education of Cyrus. I could go on, but let me just stop with two. And if we want to get that question again, I'll throw a couple more in there.
Sir, I'm familiar with the challenge to keep the book recommendations to
keep them to a minimum. That's why the Warrior Ethos was so short.
Yes, sir. And I'm a big fan of Plutarch's Life of Coriolanus as well. There's another great example of a warrior.
Yeah.
We have questions.
Let me throw in one more while we're talking about it. Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great. His whole upbringing and how he came to, he's like a supreme example of the warrior culture and warrior mindset. Also short.
We've got one here. Do you think the dynamic of war in respect to violence and the gravity of taking another life alter our shift based on how we now have longer distance weapon systems, cyber? Do you kind of talking about the character and nature of war shifting? Do we still think some of the elements like that have been always consistently true about war, i.e. violence, will remain steadfast?
It's a great question. And I've been thinking about that lately too. I think one of the reasons why stories about the ancient world resonate with modern Marines and soldiers and airmen and sailors is because war has changed so much, and it's gone so far away from the kind of the warrior ideal, the highest concept of the warrior ethos. And I really don't know. I mean, you think about things that happen at Abu Ghraib and other stuff like that, where we, our own guys and women, are into really, really gray, dark areas. But also the ability to kill from a distance, you know, with drones and stuff like that, and explosives and all that have really changed things tremendously. Like there is a story that a Spartan commander was once shown this new device, a catapult-like device that could fire a projectile 200 yards. And they demonstrated it to him, and he began to weep. And he said, "Alas, valor is no more." And the old concept of from the ancient Greeks that we still have it in our DNA, even though we never even think about it. The idea that fighting was kind of shield to shield, you know, clash to clash, helmet to helmet, so that in order for one person to kill his man, he had to be so close to him that his man could kill him, you know. And we still, you know, even if you think about Western movies, right, that we imbibe as kids, the good guy always has to kind of let the bad guy go for his gun first, right? And then it's okay to shoot. So yeah, it's a real moral quandary these days. These remote weapons that we have, and I guess, you know, it's a real challenge to hang on to a kind of a concept of warrior honor and be true to that one way or another. And it's kind of a day-to-day thing, I think, to everybody that's deployed. You know, how do you stay true to something that you could call honor when a lot of times, you know, the enemy isn't playing by those rules and warfare itself has given up on those rules.
Yes, sir. A challenge I'm very familiar with when we're out in the minefields and the IEDs of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. One question here from Josh Greer asking, did you base any of the Spartan characters, were any of those influenced from actual Marines that you served with, particularly Dionysus? Is there any inspiration for some of those characters from people that you served with or knew within the Corps?
No, I didn't actually. That's kind of not the way I write anything. You know, I try to make every character on the page be their own self. But for sure, I patterned, you know, because we really don't know anything about real Spartan training. In fact, there's only like something like 46 words or 27 words that remain extant, written by an actual Spartan. The only thing, because they were so secretive, they didn't want anybody to know what their training was like. They wouldn't allow people into their country except under special circumstances, and they had periodic deportations when they kicked strangers out. So a lot of what I wrote about in Gates of Fire, just describing the Spartan system, I had to kind of make up. You know, I just had to kind of suss it out, and I based a lot of it on just figuring that people don't change. And you know, Navy SEAL training, Ranger training, Marine Corps training, you know, it's a big thing, of course, at the age that you guys and gals all are, is an innate desire to find a mentor, you know, or multiple mentors, whether it's officers or tough old sergeants. You know, it's just those are the ones we're sort of looking at the age you guys are at. We're looking for role models, you know, for somebody we really admire. And I know that it stuck with me. I was really looking for role models. So I very much tried to include that in my concept of what Spartan training was. But the answer is no. I didn't pick any salty old gunny or anything and pattern an actual character in the book after him.
Thank you, sir. We've got a question here from Ryan Grady. She asked, Mr. Pressfield, there's a quote on page 7 that I believe sets the tone for the entirety of the book. It reads, "I felt a sense of inexpressible relief and realized that I had feared more than death, separation from them." Did you experience this during your service, despite initially wishing to avoid the draft? And if so, and if you are comfortable doing so, would you share a moment that you might have felt this way?
I certainly think that that is just absolutely true in all armies and all centuries. You know, that the bond between comrades and brothers and sisters in arms is stronger than anything else. And you read about it in all kinds of, in every era, where wounded guys that have lost their legs will try to get up out of bed somehow or somehow get back to their unit. I remember there was I wrote a book a few years ago where I went to Israel and met with veterans of the Six-Day War, the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And there was one guy named Katya Kahaner who just died at 80 something or other. And he had been wounded so badly that they pulled a blanket up over his head. He was dead as far as they were concerned. And when his brothers in arms were called upon, they were trapped at a place called the Mitla Pass. He got up out of bed, even though he was supposedly dead. He was technically dead, and got out there to them. So that, that bond, and, I felt it too, even in my own reservist kind of way.
Yes, sir. And I felt that, and Marines like that exist today. The likes of Sergeant Humphrey and Corporal Spivey and Corporal Yazzie, all Marines who I served with who were injured and just wanted to be right back in the fight with their friends. We've got a question from Michael Sager. When you wrote the book, you took some amount of creative license to bring the story to life. How did you decide what you should add to create the story while remaining true to the historical text of the battle?
That's a good question. I might be a potential writer there. I think I smell something there. The way, I'll give you a writerly answer rather than a kind of a military answer. The way I approach any subject that I'm going to write about is I ask myself first, what is this thing about? What's the theme? And in this case, to me, the theme was fear, and how people react to fear. How is courage the opposite? How is courage produced in the face of fear? So I was looking in every character to illustrate a slightly different version of an answer to that question. So I'm not sure that's exactly an answer to the question, but you can ask it again if you would want to try it.
I still find that an interesting answer, sir. So we've got one from Anya Bensing here, and she asked, and this is one of my favorite passages as well. There's a passage that identifies the role of an officer as preventing his men from becoming possessed. Was there a specific instance in which you experienced an officer taking this role? And additionally, can you talk to us about the notion of I think is it calypsis? And the officer is when they're afraid, the officer has to push them, and when they've turned themselves over to rage, the officer has to pull in the reins. And it is so true. So that was I very much identified with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure where, I really don't have any actual physical episodes where I could say I witnessed that or I participated in that. But, when you're writing something, you become totally immersed in it in the sense of the imagination. And at the same time, you're reading everything you possibly can, not just from that particular era, but for me, from all kinds of other eras to try to imbibe that. And it just seemed to me that that really is the role of the officer. It's not so much to charge into the enemy front, with bugles blowing or anything like that, but to keep everybody on an even keel. And to I read this many times where the concept is doing the ordinary things under extraordinary circumstances, and just the officer's job is sort of to get his men to the place where they can do their job and make sure that they know what that freaking job is and they don't forget it. You know, we're here to watch this crossroads, or we're here to blow up this thing, you know, and to keep them, and I think this is absolutely true, when they're out of their minds with anger or whatever, to hold them back and remember that, you know, this, we're here to do a job. And at the same time, when they're confused and frightened, and, you know, to inspire them in whatever way they can to go forward. So that is what you guys are all about. That's your challenge. It's not just to embody, to be great warriors yourselves, but to lead your men and women, and to keep them, to give them somebody they can look to. And I'll say another thing, even though I was never an officer, the highest I ever was a Lance Corporal. So I don't know anything about this other than through writing it. Is that an officer's job, I think, on the one hand, is to provide an open enough field for your own men and women to exercise their qualities of courage and imagination and what makes them great, you know, to not to be pressing them down, but to give them an opportunity and a field to act on. And at the same time, I think almost more important is protect your men and women from the officers above you, you know, and from the bad shit that's going to come down, you know, from careerists, officers above them who have only their own career in mind and who are going to try to even put people up on charges, you know, to protect your men from the bullshit that's going to come down from above, and to take that heat, you know, to stand up for them.
Yes, sir. I call that the insider threat, and that's where so much of the moral injury comes from when an officer fails by that top cover, and we sustain those betrayals. You know, but to the concept of the self-composure and the role of the officer, you know, one of my favorite passages is when Dionysius is saying, look at me, and I think that's perfect, that he, amidst all the entropy, he is the one that offers that calm and that equanimity there in the midst of the storm, and that's our role, I think. Sir, we've got a question from David Ogus. He said, could you talk about the idea mentioned in the text about the opposite of fear being love? Where did that concept come from? And do you believe that love is a key catalyst in motivating young men and women to overcome the fear of being in combat?
Yes, absolutely. I believe it. But it sort of comes down to the original first quote that you said, Tom, where about forget concepts of honor and loyalty and preserving democracy, and just fight for the guy that, or woman in this case today, that stands at your shoulder. That you know, I'm just going to kind of repeat what's in the book already, but, you know, Dionysius is through the whole, remember I said before that I always ask myself, what's the theme? What's this about? And the book to me, again, was about fear and about how do we operate in the face of fear. And Dionysius, throughout the book, he's kind of asking that question. And he's saying, well, I know that, you know, a lot of the Spartan method is to counterpoise shame to fear. You know, where you're scared to death, you want to run, you want to drop your shield, you want to flee, but you know that if you do, you know, everybody you know, including your own mother, is going to kick your ass, you know. So you've shame, but he said that I don't consider that the opposite of fear. That's just another fear, a greater fear, counterpoised against the other fear. And so he sort of, and he goes through all the other things the tricks that he uses. One thing, knowing you're an officer, you say to yourself, I'm so concerned with my men, you know, that I'll forget my own fear. I just have to take care of my own men. But he says, again, is that really the opposite of fear, or is that it's something honorable, but it's not the same? And in the end, I think that it was certainly in ancient warfare, it was the bonds of love between the men in the phalanx that was the opposite of fear. That because if you think about fear is a completely selfish emotion. It comes out of our own, like Dianika says in the story, that this flesh is the factory of fear, right? The fact that we're in this body and we know that it can be hurt and we know that it can die. And so when we're in our own heads and fearful for our own survival, that's when fear has a place to take root. But if we can get out of our heads to the man and woman that stands next to us, to the whole unit, and this is really what military training, I think, in every country in the world is all about, is teaching the one thing, that the group is more important than the individual. And that's what medals are given out for, and that's where that love comes in, you know, that the bonds with your brothers and sisters are more important than your own life, if you can do that, if you can live up to that.
So I think that's a nice segue to the next question, kind of being the sum being greater than the whole being greater than the individual here. And so on page 260, Midshipman Paul Dice points us to a great passage and says, in that moment, the phalanx forms a unity so dense and all divining that it performs not merely at the level of a machine or engine of war, but surpassing that to the state of a single organism, a beast of one blood and heart. Do you think that level of camaraderie is only achieved through combat, or can it be achieved through training? I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to.
I definitely think it, I mean, I've never been in combat, so I can't say, but I certainly think it can be achieved in training. I mean, it can be achieved in sports, you know, so, you know, it's obviously not at the same level of life and death, but definitely can be achieved, I think. And in fact, if we sort of tune into our own DNA, we can sort of see how we really want that at the visceral level. You know, our whole, everything, our cells are pulling us in that direction, you know? It doesn't have to be, and I think again, it probably goes back to the primitive hunting band and this, you know, the survival instincts that all of us have of, you know, that bond. I mean, if you even think about in the animal kingdom, a pride of lions, how they hunt, or a pack of wolves, how they can, you know, without speech, they know how to set ambushes. And one element is like a security element, another element is like the, you know, the combat element, and everybody is bound together, even though they might be 100 yards apart on whatever the field is.
Yes, sir. I agree. It can be achieved, and not only would I say it can be achieved, but it must be achieved in training before we head to combat. We've got a question from Midshipman Brandon Ferlin here. He says, sir, what would you say, are there some negative or pitfalls of having a warrior mindset that's depicted in Gates of Fire? And how is this applicable outside of the military specifically? And is this a permanent mindset, or is this a transient mindset?
That's a great question. I'm actually working on a project right now that's really about that. And I do think that, yes, there are very intense pitfalls to the warrior mindset. And mainly it is when self-restraint is gone. Self-restraint, you know, part of the highest warrior ethos, one of the reasons I said that I thought it would be great to read the life of Alexander the Great, Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great, was one of his really strong ethics, and it also comes from the life of Cyrus, was not just respect for the enemy, but love for the enemy. And the idea, I think when you see, I don't know if you guys have read about these Boogaloo boys that are out there today, some of these extremist dudes that are packing AR-15s and their whole ethic is really about violence usually against the weak, or against whoever they think of as the opposite partisan group to them. And that's when kind of the warrior ethic or whatever goes completely off the rails and becomes just outlaws, you know? The idea, you know, the idea of the round table under King Arthur was a wonderful idea, where the ideal sort of was that the strength that these knights had, the ability to inflict violence and to kill other people, and the code that they had that bonded them together, that it only be used to protect the weak and not to exploit, not to oppress, not to, I mean, I'm sure the cop that killed George Floyd, that held him down there for those 8 minutes or whatever seconds. I mean, I'm sure if we could get inside his head, he thought he was some kind of warrior, but that was the warrior concept gone off the rails into outright murder and criminality, and where somebody could look at another human being right in front of him, begging for his life, and blow that off somehow. So yeah, there are definite pitfalls. I don't think they really were there in the Battle of Thermopylae, because that was, if anything, that was the last sort of good war there ever was. But yeah, I think that a lot of what you officers who are training these young midshipmen here, and is in about that concept of self-restraint. That when the enemy is the enemy, then you're going after them with everything you got. But once they put their hands up, then they're human beings.
So that actually kind of addresses, we got a question from Midshipman Mary Margaret West, and she's talking about the idea of, I'm going to butcher this, but esoteric harmonia, the strong self-composure, and what happens when we lose it, and then how do we regain that center? And so I think you kind of alluded to that in your what you just said. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Again, I think that's like we were talking before. That's really the officer's responsibility. I mean, it's the officer who has to hold his or her men together. I don't want to say that a lance corporal or a private can be forgiven for going off the reservation, but an officer can't. That's his or her job to hold that together. There's a concept. I think this is actually in the Warrior Ethos, my little book about in the Israeli army, the IDF, the concept of purity of the weapon, which is that, and that goes down all the way to the lowest private. That again, it's a self-restraint concept. That the individual warrior himself or herself, recognizing that they have a weapon in their hand that can take human life, has to be responsible for that weapon and make the judgment call moment to moment. Is this valid, what I'm doing, or is it not? And that's really, in many ways, what the training is all about. Because things can get out of hand. Possession, catalepsis can get out of hand. So yeah, esoteric harmonica, that the idea of being together internally.
Great, sir. Can you talk to us about what influenced you to develop the Spartan women characters the way you did?
That's a great question. I'll tell you one story from the writing of Gates of Fire. The book was done. It was ready to be published, but I had two female editors, Kate Misiak and Nita Talblin, and they kind of called me into their office and they said, "We love these Spartan women. We got to have give us another big scene. There's not enough, about the women." And of course, like every other writer, I immediately reacted, "Oh, I hate that idea. I don't want to do it. It's too much work. It's already done. Forget it." But after about a week of thinking about this, I did come up with another scene, and that scene turned out to be the one that I've gotten the most positive feedback. It's the one scene that people seem to remember the most in the book, and it's the scene where Leonidas explains to the lady Paralia why he chose the 300 Spartans that he chose and not some other group. And the point that he makes is he chose them not for their own courage, but for the courage of their women, because their wives, their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, because he knew as he himself was going to be on this outfit that nobody was coming home from this outfit. And and the idea that if those Spartan women, the wives and mothers and sisters and daughters of the Spartans who were going to die at Thermopylae, if they fell apart, Sparta would fall apart, And if Sparta fell apart, the whole rest of Greece would fall apart and the whole war would be lost. But if the women could hold themselves together, dry-eyed, then Sparta would hold together and all Greece would survive. So I do think that, you know, our contemporary military in America is a warrior culture, but it's embedded in a consumer culture, a culture whose ideals are completely the opposite. I think I said this in War Ethos too, but Sparta was different. The army was a warrior culture embedded in a warrior society, so that even the grandmothers would kick, you know, the young guy's ass. You know, there was, and the women were really the absolute backbone of Sparta. That no young warrior could look for support from his mother or his wife or anybody if he was going to violate, you know, the ideals, that the women would enforce it. And they also were supposedly the most beautiful women in Greece too.
Yes, sir. Well, while we're on this topic, I think we got another great question to kind of follow that up with. At the end of the novel, there's a line where Leonidas states that he chose the men not for their own valor, lady, but for that of the women. I was wondering if you could expand on why you chose to include this line. Many war stories failed to tell the story of the people back home. So I was interested in this idea of the widowed women upholding the society.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was just saying, I guess. But that, you know, we see it today, like and I'm sure you guys know this way better than me, particularly in elite units like special forces, where there are kind of really small groups of teams, you know, team of 12 or something that'll all live together, you know, or have their houses around Fort Bragg or whatever, and how when they're deployed as a unit, their wives live right next door to each other. It's not like it's scattered in, you know, Oklahoma and Nevada and whatever. And they are sort of Spartan women, and it's a tough road for them because they're usually in a society that, you know, when they go to the grocery store, they go to the swimming pool or whatever, other people don't understand it, don't get it. I think they're making a big deal about how hard it is for them, but also how they really stick together and support each other. And the wider families stick together and support each other, the grandfathers and grandmothers and so forth. So yeah, that's a real element that sometimes we here in the States forget about.
Sir, we've got a mid bringing up some authors that from the Vietnam era, and we actually were fortunate to have Carl Melantis last semester come and talk to it in my literature war class. So this question asks, many combat veterans like Marlantis and Tim O'Brien use writing to work through their own combat experience. Did you find writing to be cathartic in any way?
I did, but in a whole other way. I mean, I'm a believer in previous lives, and not on an intellectual level, but just in my own bones, you know? And so somehow for me, I mean, I've written, I think, 5 books set in that ancient world. And for me to travel via the imagination back into that world, it was very, I don't know if cathartic is the word, but I felt like I was more at home there than I am here in this contemporary world. So yeah, that's my answer to that.
I can identify, sir. Destiny Wong here. She says, sir, my favorite line in the novel reads, habit will be your champion. When you train the mind to think one way and one way only, when you refuse to allow it to think in another, that will produce great strength in battle. Was there a particular moment in your life that inspired you to write this line? If so, what was that moment?
It's really, that line is really kind of about the artist's life and the writer's life. You know, people think that it's a piece of cake to sit down at a typewriter or at a canvas and bang something out. But there's an internal enemy there that you have to go up against every day, and it defeats a lot of people. And in that case, habit is a tremendous ally. I think in everything, even in like say fitness, going to the gym or running or whatever it is, any sort of thing, or the training that you guys do, any sort of thing that is really, really hard, and that we all feel tremendous resistance, and we don't want to get out of bed and do this, whatever it is, that habit is a great, it's a mighty ally, like Dianika says. And also not to allow your mind to go into those other rooms, the idea that, well, maybe I will skip it today, it just can't be done. So habit's a great trick. People are always these days looking for a hack, which I hate that freaking word. But habit, if there is a kind of a hack, that's it.
Sir, the habit and the discipline, I think, is what gets us to greatness. And so I take maybe a different approach to the passage about the house with many rooms. And the Spartans, while I wholly concur with that idea about our ability to compartmentalize and how critical, especially on the battlefield, it is to not become possessed by those emotions. And I understand how being emotionally disconnected allows us to kind of stay focused on our habits, stay focused in the present. But I also fear that those rooms are where our humanity is. And so if we don't enter into those rooms of anger or sadness or loneliness, sometimes we might not get the full human experience. And what I would argue is that we should enter into those rooms for a time to enrich our overall human experience, so that we can feel sadness, we can feel loneliness, so that we can feel joy and happiness and greater peaks, and that we can know what rage looks like, and that we know that we can contain that rage and come back, and that we just have to avoid the pitfall of becoming stuck in those rooms.
I would actually agree with you, Tom. That's not really sort of not the rooms I was talking about. The rooms I was talking about were sort of like drug addiction or total, dissolution of ethics, harming somebody else and taking pleasure in it, because those are human, we all have the propensity to do that. But I think those are the rooms that we should never go into.
Copy all, sir. Thank you for clarifying. We've got a question here. How did Sparta lose its status as a leading status as a warrior culture, and are we at risk presently of potentially the same demise?
That's another great question, and it will lead me to bringing up another suggested book, except it's very thick. I have one here, it's about that thick, is Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which is about 50, 60 years after Thermopylae, and that's when Sparta did fall apart in the moral sense. And what happened, and this is kind of interesting, particularly for you guys and women. Like I said before, Sparta was a very cloistered culture. In a lot of ways, it was like the Amish or the Quakers, in that they wouldn't let, what they considered corrupting influences in. And as a result, the Spartans were not really inoculated, sort of like you were just saying, Tom, about the rooms. They were not really inoculated against some of the vices that were out there. For instance, there was no real money in Sparta. So what happened in the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartans kind of had to leave their country and be out in the wide world, fighting with the Navy and all that kind of thing, and they were exposed to money, they sort of had no natural defenses against it. And they kind of caved in. And a lot of them became kind of brutal guys that, were really, really hard on people underneath them. And they became quite hated. And there are stories, to go back to the Spartan women again, where they have certain letters still existent from Spartan mothers to their sons, who are now colonels and the equivalent overseas, and had heard that their sons were acting inappropriately. And one of the letters said, "Quit your thieving or quit breathing." And so that sort of So sometimes you guys now that are in this kind of cloistered environment of the Naval Academy and of the military, it can be, it can be a little bit potential source of weakness, not to be really, but I'm sure you guys are all very aware of what's going on out in the rest of the world, but just keep aware.
Yes, sir. Our mids all take our ethics courses and we're paying close attention. So I wanted to maybe address one more passage, and then it's when they take the tickets from the bracelets. And this passage to me really emulates the idea of what we call the final roll call. And I don't know if you've witnessed that final roll call that we do as Marines, but we hold the formation, and then we call a couple of Marines who are present, and they echo back present. And then we start with the Marines who are fallen, and we say their name once, we say their name a second time, and we say their name a third time. And just the overall power of that absence, if you've ever witnessed or partaken in one of these ceremonies. And so you have that part, and then you lead right into this part here, that half of him, the best part, a man sets aside and leaves behind. He banishes from his heart all feelings of tenderness and mercy, all compassion and kindness, all thoughts or concept of enemy as a man, a human being like himself. He marches into battle bearing only that second portion of himself, the baser measure, that half which knows slaughter and butchery and turns a blind eye to quarter. He could not fight at all if he did not do this. So the idea that when we break the bracelets, we leave part of ourselves and we become kind of this animal. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Well, I do think that, again, this kind of goes back to the officer's role. And the officers really is not allowed to break that bracelet. They may literally break the bracelet because it's like a dog tag to identify their body if they get killed. But the officer can never let that good part of himself or herself get away, and it always has to be ready to support, but also to rein in his or her men. So yeah, that's actually a totally true thing that the Spartans did with those little twigs. And yeah, so I guess my point would be that an officer is not allowed to do that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, sir. Appreciate that, sir. Let me see if Colonel Smithman or any of the senior Marines want to jump back on the line, and then I'd just like to, if you have any closing comments for their group.
Sir, in addition to just thanking you for your time, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the consistency of your writing, right? Even through the Legend of Bagger Vance, right? You still have an ability to touch those intangible issues of character, almost the warrior ethos, all the way through in everything that you write about. And so I appreciate that just from a personal level, as well as in those questions came earlier, like how does that apply, right? Is it simply about being on the battlefield, or is it really how you look at your perspective of life? And what are the things that matter?
I just missed just the one sentence before the end there. What was that?
I'm sorry, say that again, sir.
I didn't quite hear the question at the very end. What was it?
Well, I just appreciate the consistency with which you write in all of your work, whether it's Legend of Bagger Vance, those intangible qualities that find a way to be applied in life because they're issues of character. And so I just wanted to express my appreciation for consistency.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for reading Bagger Vance. I appreciate that.
Sir, and so we're pushing into our last week here. We actually head back out to the field tomorrow morning. We've got a couple of ospreys coming to pick us up and push us back out to the tree line. We're going to push hard right up until the end. And between reading your book as we entered into this experience, having a discussion around the text, and then you coming here and providing and enriching that experience for us. I just want to express my gratitude. I hope that in the spring, we're able to bring you in and back into the classroom. That would be, I know my mids would absolutely love that.
Well, that would be great. I hope that COVID thing is a thing of the past by then.
We all do, sir. Sir, so if you don't have anything else for us, again, I just want to express my overall gratitude and thank you so much, sir, Semper Fidelis. And
Actually, I do have one thing, one last thought.
yes, sir, we're ready to receive.
Right now, you guys are at the academy and you're in, you know, this leatherneck situation, and the structure of your lives is imposed on you from the outside. Right? There's a plan of the day. In the morning, you know what you got to wear, you know where you have to be, you know where you're going to eat, you know when you're going to go to bed. But as officers, there's a moment when it has to go from discipline, externally imposed discipline, to self-discipline. And externally offered reinforcement, medals and praise and that kind of stuff, to self-reinforcement. And that's when I think you move beyond the warrior archetype to the next warrior archetype. And your senior teachers and mentors here are really models for that, I think. Because remember, they're here to give to you. You know, that's all what it's all about from their point of view. So I would just encourage you to keep that in mind. There is going to come a moment when that gear has to shift from externally imposed discipline and reinforcement to self-generated discipline and reinforcement. And that's, I wish you all the best when you pass through that membrane, and I'm sure that you're thinking of that now, but I would say keep it top of mind if you can, as you're through all your studies and all your exercises. Congratulations. I salute you guys. God bless you. Godspeed. Don't look back and don't look down.
Thanks so much, sir. Semper Fidelis.
Semper Fi.
Bye, sir.